Hello, Sublation Media viewers. This video will present a critique of the current pro-Palestinian protest movement that breaks the usual frame. Rather than asking whether Israel is a liberal democracy in a sea of Islamic reaction, or a genocidal colonial project imposing a white supremacist agenda on the periphery, this video will only examine what is called the left. It will attempt to demonstrate that the left has lost its way, and it will attempt to explain how and why this has happened. This video was co-written with Jack Ross, author of The Strange Death of American Exceptionalism. The left has been transformed into a force perpetuating what the philosopher and historian Paul Piccone called artificial negativity. In 1978, in an essay entitled Culture and Politics in the Age of Artificial Negativity, Piccone argued that in the 20th century, monopoly capitalism arose to organize the whole of society, the whole globe. The left and its socialist project were flattened and then resuscitated. After the instrumental reason of the progressive imperial state totally reconciled the contradictions and countervailing forces that initially regulated capitalism through the market, Piccone wrote, in the mid-1960s, this destruction of contradictions necessitated the creation of artificial negativity. For me, the term artificial negativity is made easier to understand if I turn to the science fiction program The Prisoner, a televisual parable that premiered in 1967 on ITV. The Prisoner was the brainchild of the actor Patrick McGoohan, a contrarian Catholic who, after spending years playing a spy on the ITV program Danger Man, and after turning in a performance that led Broccoli and Saltzman to offer him the chance to play James Bond in Dr. No, an opportunity he would turn down for religious reasons, wanted to undo or subvert the worldview of the Cold War spy drama. The Prisoner would be a show that explored the underbelly of the security state, a show that challenged the conformism and totalitarianism that had emerged in the West alongside the Eastern socialist totalitarianism that James Bond, the Saint, and Danger Man were committed to combating. In The Prisoner, the titular character, a former spy, has been kidnapped and imprisoned, kept under constant surveillance in a village located on a remote island, and subjected to psychological torture as his captors attempt to force a confession out of him. They want an explanation for his resignation. In the second episode of the series, The Chimes of Big Ben, number 6 is led to believe that he has found a compatriot in his struggle against the village, and even temporarily believes that he has escaped. However, before he divulges his secrets to the people he believes to be his bosses at MI6, he figures out that he's been set up, and his trip off the island and to London has been the product of an elaborate subterfuge. Piccone's theory of artificial negativity claims that leftist resistance to the imperialist state is artificial, created through a kind of subterfuge. But unlike in The Prisoner, the aim is not to get society to crack and divulge information — the progressive state already has all the information — but rather the aim is to create movements so the capitalist political order can move. The protests and resistance are not in opposition to the functioning of monopoly capitalism, but are instead mechanisms that the imperialist state uses to move and grow. The best way to understand the protests born out of artificial negativity is to think of them as a consequence of defeat. Rather than standing up to authority and power, contemporary protesters have been bred, raised, and trained to mistake officially sanctioned negativity for rebellion. Their understanding of themselves and the world has been narrowed, limited, to such a degree as to make independent thought and critique at least improbable, if not impossible. After a century of what might be called counter-revolution, the few glimmers of actual resistance and critique that remain don't often appear in official left magazines or journals. They aren't to be found on what's called BreadTube, but are most often offered up by self-described conservatives. Over 35 years ago, it was not the American left dissident Noam Chomsky, but a conservative Straussian named Alan Bloom who wrote the book The Closing of the American Mind, that described how the teaching of nihilism, relativism, and what's called deconstruction was miseducating young people, undermining their ability to think critically, while sabotaging standards of truth. Today, it is the conservative Ross Douthat who notes that the pro-Palestinian protest movement is founded upon this long-standing project of miseducation. On April 27, 2024, Ross Douthat wrote a column for the New York Times entitled, "What Students Read Before They Protest." In it, he wrote, "I speak to college students and high school students fairly often, and it is common to meet kids whose entire sense of contemporary political challenges consists of racism and climate change." Douthat describes today's universities and institutions as places where students receive a, quote, dramatic intellectual and historical narrowing, especially when it comes to the history of the 20th century. There's no Orwell, no Solzhenitsyn, no Lasch, no Philip Rieff, and class critiques are mostly invisible, left behind in the 19th century with Karl Marx. The miseducation of the young is having consequences today, as it has helped to create a protest movement that is artificial, that will only return the protesters to the village. As the people of Gaza face Israeli bombers targeting the very refugee centers where over 1 million non-combatants were directed to shelter, students have risked their academic and professional futures by protesting in solidarity, which is why it is all the more necessary to examine this protest movement critically. On May 6, 2024, Politico reported that even as pro-Palestinian protesters have dubbed President Biden Genocide Joe, the groups behind the demonstrations have received financial backing from Democratic Party operatives, specifically Jewish Voice for Peace, if not now, within our lifetime, the Working Families Party, the Westchester Peace Action Committee Foundation, the National Students for Justice in Palestine Group, and many others have all received funding from the Tides Foundation, a dark money operation that Democratic Party donors use to skirt campaign finance laws. Maintaining artificial negativity is an end in itself for the progressive capitalist state, directing and redirecting the dissatisfaction that quite naturally arises within the young, the unemployed or underemployed, and even the relatively comfortable middle classes back into dependency is the overall goal. This explains why the student protest movement has remained ideologically trapped within a Schmittian friend-enemy politics of fragmentation and impossibilism. The demand that Israel dismantle itself as an illegitimate occupier of indigenous lands cannot be realized and has instead led to more moderate and practical demands. For instance, the demand that universities divest from companies with ties to Israel. But this will have no short-term consequence. In fact, according to the sociologist David Meyer, they are unlikely to ever have a direct financial impact.
If you want to strangle the companies that are invested in Israel, when the firm that's holding these stocks sells them, somebody else is going to buy them. Historically, divestment movements haven't made much direct financial impact on the companies. They're more important as the basis of a political campaign, raising awareness and spurring political action, encouraging people to do other things besides divestment.
Myers goes on to say that what's more important than the divestment is the cultural impact, the artistic expression that emerges from the divestment efforts.
It was also accompanied by, this artistic boycott. And if you go through YouTube, you can find a collective song called Ain't Gonna Play Sun City, the artistic boycott, that was written by Steve Van Zandt, Bruce Springsteen's guitarist. And it's a bop. It works. So there's a lot of things going on besides divestment. The kind of brilliance of divestment as a strategy is that it allows young people to connect their lives to the political cause they care about and to have something to do that seems like it matters.
As difficult and counterintuitive as it seems, student protesters should be asking themselves what future political campaigns they're being shepherded into. Who is planning on using the energy created by the strictly cultural rejection of Zionism? In the 1980s, Bruce Springsteen and the Artists United Against Apartheid raised awareness and supported the Democratic Party. Springsteen, along with the rest of the pop establishment, supported Bill Clinton in 1992. However, despite rhetorical differences, the Democrats and Republicans had largely behaved in the same way towards South Africa, obeying the UN embargo against arming the apartheid state only to the degree that it was convenient or thought to be in the national interest. JFK, for example, made promises to stop selling arms to South Africa with a proviso that this promise could be broken if circumstances necessitated arming South Africa in response to communist aggression. Carter's embrace of the embargo was presaged by the Ford administration's, and specifically Kissinger's, enforcement of the ban. All in all, U.S. geopolitical policies are led by pragmatism and not ideology. The U.S. reacts to the world and always tries to cover its bets.
Any word of what we're heading for?
I hear it's San Marcos.
We fighting for or against the government?
CIA's not taking any chances this time. Some of us are for, some of us are going to be against them.
Oh.
And the same thing is true domestically. The Democrats and the Republicans always try to have things every which way and don't worry about consistency. What this means for the protesters is that they are being led back into the Democratic Party and will be supported or suppressed for pragmatic rather than ideological reasons. The solution for Palestinians is well known, as is the impossibility of enacting it. In 2003, the political historian Tony Judt outlined the impasse that had already been reached between Palestine and Israel, and his conclusions should be easy for today's activists to take up and understand. He wrote, "The true alternative facing the Middle East in coming years will be between an ethnically cleansed Greater Israel and a single integrated binational state of Jews and Arabs, Israelis and Palestinians. That is indeed how the hardliners in Sharon's cabinet see the choice, and that is why they anticipate the removal of the Arabs as the ineluctable condition for the survival of a Jewish state. But what if there was no place in the world today for a Jewish state? What if the binational solution was not just increasingly likely, but actually a desirable outcome? It is not such a very odd thought. Most of the readers of this essay live in pluralist states, which have long since become multi-ethnic and multicultural. Christian Europe is a dead letter. Western civilization today is a patchwork of colors and religions and languages, of Christians, Jews, Muslims, Arabs, Indians, and many others. In the 21 years that have passed since Judt recommended liberal multiculturalism to Israel, holding the patchwork of colors and religions and languages together under the banner of Western civilization has proven to be problematic. However, one explanation for the difficulty, along with the obvious political economic pressures that have befallen the West and the globe, is the way the critiques of liberalism and the West have effaced rather than altered our understanding of the global society built upon the foundation of the French and American revolutions. Teaching Foucault, rather than Orwell or Adorno, has meant abandoning the universalism required to obtain a melting pot or even a patchwork society. Worse still, the abandonment of class politics to the 19th century, the belief that the working class as an organized political force could be tossed into the dustbin of history, along with the entrepreneurial capitalism that imperialism and monopoly power replaced, is to risk taking up the ideology of imperialism as its own critique. In the year 2000, Horam Hazani published his book, The Jewish State, The Struggle for Israel's Soul. In it, he argued that Israel was attempting to lose its Judaism. Hazani argued that intermarriage, secularization, and specifically the influence of Martin Buber through the Hebrew University and the paper Die Welt was subverting and even destroying Zionism and Judaism, both from the inside.
Leave me alone! Jill, this is Sergeant Sacker. Listen to me. We've traced the call. It's coming from inside the house. Our squad cars are going over there right now. Just get out of that house. Jill.
The contradiction within civil society is the contradiction of class. It arises out of the freedom of labor to sell its labor time for a wage, and it is this contradiction that must be overcome through an organized effort to sublate the working class, to sublate this freedom. The notion that the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis is fundamental, that Judaic and Islamic peoples have fundamentally different interests and cannot come together to share a productive and future-oriented life, is not only an artificial negativity that only services the current and future imperialist forms of capitalism, it is also a violation of the very religious ethic that Judaism, Islam, and Christianity share in common. The alternative to genocide, to artificial negativity, to war crimes and the reproduction and perpetuation of conflict and thievery and bloodshed, should begin with the embrace of those old ethics, the ethics of Moses and the Ten Commandments, which were, after all, meant for everyone.
Go, proclaim liberty throughout all the lands, unto all the inhabitants thereof.